Long ago, in the lively city of Lagos, there lived a wonderful family known as the Stevens. They were not a rich family, but they had something more valuable: love, unity, and happiness. Mr. Stephen, a strong and hardworking man, believed that no matter how busy life got, family should always come first. His wife, Mrs. Stephen, was just as hardworking, always making sure their home was filled with warmth and care. Together, they raised their two beautiful daughters, Dorcas and Janet. Dorcas, the elder sister, was a shining star. She was intelligent, smart, and focused on her studies. She always thought before she spoke and never liked to waste time on unnecessary things. On the other hand, Janet was the playful one. She was full of life, always laughing and making everyone around her smile. She had a kind heart, but sometimes, she didn't take things as seriously as she should. Despite their different personalities, the sisters shared an unbreakable bond. Their home was always filled with love, laughter, and the sweet aroma of their mother's cooking. No matter how busy Mr. and Mrs. Stephen were with work, they always made time for their daughters. Every Sunday evening was special. It was the one day of the week when the family would either go out together or gather in the living room to talk. Mr. Stephen loved telling his daughters stories, not just for fun but to teach them important life lessons. "My daughters," he would say, "life is not always easy, but if you are diligent and focused, you will go far." Dorcas always listened carefully, nodding her head in agreement, while Janet would giggle, sometimes getting distracted. Years passed, and before they knew it, the girls had finished secondary school. It was time for university. Mr. Stephen, though not a wealthy man, did everything he could to ensure his daughters got the best education. He worked extra hours, sacrificed his own comfort, and even took out loans just to pay their school fees. "My girls must have a bright future," he often told his wife. Finally, after years of hard work, the day they had all been waiting for arrived. Dorcas and Janet graduated from university. It was a moment of great joy for the family. Mr. and Mrs. Stephen couldn't stop smiling. They had done their part as parents, and now, their daughters were ready to face the world. Not long after graduation, something amazing happened. Dorcas received a job offer in Ogun State. It wasn't just any job, it was a high-paying, prestigious position. The moment she got the news, her heart pounded with excitement. She rushed home, eager to share the good news with her family. As soon as she stepped into the house, she shouted, "Daddy! Mommy! Janet! I have something to tell you." Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned to her. "What is it, my daughter?" Mr. Stephen asked with a smile. "I got the job." Dorcas beamed. "A good job. A high-paying job in Ogun State." There was a moment of silence before an explosion of joy filled the room. Mrs. Stephen clapped her hands, her eyes filled with happy tears. Janet jumped up and down, hugging her sister tightly. Mr. Stephen, who had always believed in hard work, nodded proudly. "This calls for a celebration," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I am so proud of you, my daughter." That night, the Stevens gathered around the dining table. The air was filled with laughter as they ate their favorite meal together, celebrating Dorcas's achievement. The next morning, the Stevens' house was filled with mixed emotions. It was time for Dorcas to leave for Ogun State and begin her new job. She had spent the night packing her bags, carefully arranging her clothes, books, and other essentials. The excitement of starting a new chapter in her life was there, but so was the sadness of leaving her family behind. Mr. and Mrs. Stevens stood in the living room, watching as their daughter zipped up her last suitcase. Janet sat on the bed, playing with the handle of one of Dorcas's bags, her face unusually quiet. Finally, the moment arrived. Dorcas wheeled her luggage to the front door, and her family followed closely behind. Her father placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "My daughter, always remember the values we taught you. Work hard, be honest, and never forget where you come from." Mrs. Stephen wiped a tear from her and pulled Dorcas into a warm embrace. "Stay safe, my dear," she whispered. Janet, who had been holding back her emotions, suddenly burst into tears and hugged her sister tightly. I miss you, Dorcas, she sobbed. Dorcas smiled and patted her sister's back. I miss you too, but we'll talk every day. With one last wave, she entered the car. As it drove away, her parents stood at the entrance, watching until it disappeared from sight. The house suddenly felt a little quieter, a little emptier. Time moved forward, and life continued for the Stevens. 1 month after Dorcas left, Janet came home one evening with a bright smile on her face. Behind her stood a tall young man with a confident but respectful demeanor. Daddy, Mommy, she said excitedly, this is Jide, my fiancé. Mr. and Mrs. Steven exchanged a glance. Their daughter was growing up so fast. Mr. Steven stepped forward and shook Jide's hand firmly. Young man, welcome to our home. Mrs. Steven smiled warmly. You are welcome, my son. Jide nodded politely. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ma. Over the next few weeks, the families met and made arrangements. A few months later, Janet and Jide had their wedding, and it was a day of joy and celebration. The hall was beautifully decorated, and guests filled the seats. Dorcas took time off work to attend, standing proudly beside her sister throughout the event. As the camera flashes went off, capturing moments of happiness, the Stevens felt proud. Their little girl was now a married woman, stepping into a new phase of life. 3 years passed, and Janet's home was filled with even more happiness. God blessed her and Jide with a baby boy. From the moment he was born, they knew he was special. His tiny fingers wrapped around Janet's hand, and tears of joy streamed down her face. His name will be Destiny, Jide announced proudly on the 8th day. Destiny was showered with love from the very beginning. His parents adored him, his grandparents couldn't stop spoiling him, and even Dorcas, though busy with work, never missed a chance to send gifts for him. As Destiny grew, he became the center of attention in the house. If he wanted something, his parents bought it for him. If he cried, they rushed to comfort him. They wanted him to have everything he desired. Time flew, and soon Destiny was old enough to start school. He was a bright child, curious and full of energy. But one day, something unusual happened. Jide was in the living room when Destiny returned from school. As always, he called him over. Destiny, let me check your bag. Destiny hesitated for a moment, but then slowly handed over his school bag. Jide unzipped it and pulled out a bundle of pencils, 3 of them. His brows furrowed. Destiny, where did you get these pencils? I don't remember buying them for you. Destiny shifted uncomfortably. I just found them. Jide's face turned serious. Found them? Destiny, did someone give them to you? Destiny shook his head. Jide took a deep breath. Son, you need to return these. They don't belong to you. Before Destiny could answer, Janet walked into the room. She saw the pencils in her husband's hand and frowned. Dear, leave him alone. He's just a smart boy. After all, he lost one of his books last week. Jide looked at his wife in shock. Janet, that's not the point. If he took these pencils without permission, it's wrong. We have to correct him now before it becomes a habit. But Janet waved a hand dismissively. It's just pencils, Jide. You're overreacting. Jide sighed heavily, looking at his son. Destiny stared at the floor, unsure of what to do. A small mistake had just been made, but little did they know, it was the beginning of something much bigger. The next day, something worse happened. Destiny came home from school, but this time, he didn't just have extra pencils, he brought books that didn't belong to him. Jide was sitting in the living room when he opened Destiny's bag and saw them. His heart sank. This was no longer a small mistake, it was becoming a habit. Destiny. Jide called, his voice firm. Destiny hesitated at the door, sensing his father's anger. Slowly, he walked forward. Jide held up the books. Where did you get this? Destiny lowered his head. I just brought them. Jide's heart pounded in his chest. Brought them. You mean you took them? Destiny didn't respond. That silence was enough to confirm his father's fear. Without hesitation, Jide grabbed the cane and gave him a few strokes. Destiny screamed and ran straight to his mother, crying loudly. Janet, who was in the bedroom, jumped up in shock. "What happened to my son?" she cried, pulling him close. Destiny pointed at his father. "Daddy beat me." Janet's heart filled with rage. She stormed into the living room, her eyes blazing with anger. "Jide, what is the meaning of this? Do you want to kill my only child?" Jide looked at her in disbelief. "Kill him? Janet, don't you see what's happening? He is stealing. He's bringing home things that are not his. If we don't stop him now, it will get worse." Janet folded her arms. "So, because of small books, you want to break his body? Is that how you want to raise him? Do you want to destroy his confidence?" Jide shook his head. "Janet, you are the one destroying him. You are teaching him that stealing is okay." Janet scoffed. "I will not stand here and let you beat my child like an animal." From that day, the once joyful home started to turn into a silent one. There was no more laughter, no more late-night family talks. Jide and Janet barely spoke to each other. Every time Jide tried to correct Destiny, Janet stood in the way, defending him. Destiny continued bringing other people's things home, new phones, bags, books, even laptops. Whenever Jide confronted him, Janet would step in. "He's just a smart boy," she would say, smiling proudly. Jide eventually gave up. He realized that no matter what he said, Janet would not listen. If he tried to correct Destiny, it would only lead to another fight. So, he kept quiet, watching helplessly as his son walked down the wrong path. One day, during the school holiday, Janet approached Jide. "Dear, tomorrow Destiny and I will be traveling to my sister Dorcas's house. We want to spend the holiday there." Jide sighed. "No problem. But please, caution your son." Janet rolled her eyes. "I hear you, sir." The next morning, she packed their bags, and they traveled to Ogun State. When they arrived at Dorcas's house, she welcomed them with open arms. "Janet. My dear sister. You are welcome." Janet smiled. "Thank you, sister." Dorcas looked at the young boy standing beside her. "Destiny, my big boy. Come here and give your auntie a hug." Destiny ran into her arms, smiling. As they entered the house, Dorcas asked, "How is your husband, Jide?" Janet waved a hand dismissively. "He's fine." "And your husband?" Dorcas sighed. "Oh, he traveled for work." Destiny quickly made himself comfortable, playing with Dorcas's children. Everything seemed normal, until the next day. The sun had just set when Dorcas walked into her room to pick up some money. But as she reached for it, her hand met an empty surface. She frowned. "That's strange. I remember putting money here." She walked into the living room where Janet was seated. "Sister, please, did you see any money here?" Janet shook her head. "No, I didn't see anything." Dorcas was confused. She searched again but found nothing. A few hours later, her son came to her quietly. "Mommy, I saw Destiny taking the money." Dorcas's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure?" "Yes, Mommy," the boy nodded firmly. Dorcas called Destiny. "Come here." Destiny walked in slowly. "Yes, Auntie." Dorcas's voice was gentle but firm. "Where did you keep my money?" Destiny looked up, his eyes wide. "I didn't take anything, Auntie." Dorcas took a deep breath. She didn't want to accuse him wrongly, but something didn't feel right. She walked to his bag and unzipped it. Her eyes widened when she saw the missing money hidden inside. She turned to Destiny, disappointment written all over her face. "Why did you do this?" Before Destiny could answer, she picked up a cane and gave him a few strokes. Destiny cried and ran straight to his mother. Janet rushed in, her face full of concern. What happened? Destiny sobbed. Auntie beat me. Dorcas turned to her sister. Janet, I caught him stealing my money. You need to train your son properly. Janet folded her arms. He is just a small boy, sister. You shouldn't have beaten him like that. Dorcas sighed heavily. Is this how you are raising him? Huh? Janet, I pray you don't regret this one day. Janet smirked. I will not. Dorcas shook her head, staring at her sister with deep concern. She could see what was happening, but Janet was blind to it. Little did Janet know, she was planting a seed that would one day grow into something she could not control. 2 weeks after Janet and Destiny returned from Dorcas's house, life seemed to go back to normal, or at least, that's what everyone thought. One evening, Dorcas was arranging her wardrobe when she suddenly realized something was missing. She checked again, turning over her clothes, looking in her jewelry box, but her heart began to pound. Her gold jewelry was gone. She searched every corner of the house, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. That jewelry was expensive and held sentimental value. After searching for hours, she finally picked up her phone and dialed Janet's number. Hello, Janet. Yes, sister, Janet answered, her voice casual. Tell your son to return my gold jewelry right now. Dorcas said, her voice shaking with anger. There was silence on the other end before Janet scoffed. What are you talking about, my sister? Are you trying to say my son is a thief? Jide, who was in the living room, overheard the conversation and immediately came closer. Dorcas took a deep breath. Janet, I didn't call your son a thief. I'm only asking you to check. My jewelry is missing, and the last time this happened, it was Destiny. Janet frowned. I can't believe this. My son is not a thief. Jide finally stepped forward. Janet, instead of getting angry, why don't you just ask him? Janet sighed and turned to Destiny, who was standing nearby, listening. Destiny, she called, her voice softer now. Come here. Destiny walked in slowly, avoiding eye contact. Janet folded her arms. Did you take Auntie Dorcas's gold jewelry? Answer me now. For a moment, Destiny didn't move. Then, without a word, he turned and walked to his room. When he returned, he was holding the missing jewelry in his hand. Janet's mouth dropped open in shock. Destiny. Why are you disgracing me like this? Jide shook his head and spoke up. I warned you, Janet. I told you this would happen, but you refused to listen. Janet couldn't even look at her husband. She quickly arranged for the jewelry to be wheeled back to Dorcas. When Dorcas received it, she called Janet again. Sister, please, I am begging you, handle your son before he goes out of your hands. You still have time. But Janet's reply was the same as before. He is just a young boy. He will change. Dorcas sighed heavily. I just hope you won't regret this. 20 years later. Time flew, and before anyone knew it, Destiny had grown into a full-grown man. But he had not changed. In fact, he had become even worse. Jide and Janet had lost all control over him. They could no longer correct him, no longer advise him. If they tried to talk, he would raise his voice at them. The same boy Janet once defended had now become her greatest sorrow. Destiny had become a nightmare to his own parents. A menace to society. It started with small things. He would steal from the neighbors in the compound. At first, it was unnoticed, but soon, people began to complain. Madam Janet, talk to your son. He stole my money, one neighbor shouted. Another neighbor added, he took my phone last night. We cannot live in peace in this compound anymore. Janet had no words. She had spent years defending him, and now, she couldn't control him anymore. Then, things got worse. Destiny met a group of bad boys and joined them. He started carrying weapons, and soon, they formed a gang. They began robbing shops, markets, and even big supermarkets. But Destiny was not satisfied, he wanted more. One night, his gang planned something bigger. Let's rob a bank, Destiny suggested. His gang members agreed. They gathered weapons, mapped out their strategy, and prepared for the biggest robbery of their lives. The day of the robbery came. Everything seemed to be going as planned. They stormed into the bank, threatening people, taking money, and forcing the workers to cooperate. But they didn't realize that someone had already called the police. Within minutes, sirens wailed, and police cars surrounded the building. There was no escape. A shootout followed, but the police overpowered them. Destiny and his gang were arrested on the spot. When Jide and Janet received the news, Janet collapsed in shock. My son," she cried. Jide shook his head, tears in his eyes. "I warned you, Janet. I told you, but you never listened." Destiny and his gang were taken to court. After several hearings, the judge pronounced the final sentence. The court finds you guilty of armed robbery. You and your gang are sentenced to death by firing squad. Destiny stood in silence as the words echoed in his ears. At that moment, he remembered every warning his father had given him. He remembered every time Dorcas had advised his mother. He remembered every opportunity he had to change, but he had ignored them all. The day had finally come. Destiny sat in the prison cell, his hands shaking as he looked at the iron bars that separated him from the outside world. He had spent the night awake, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The reality of death had sunk in. As the sun rose, the guards arrived. "It's time," one of them said, unlocking the cell door. Destiny swallowed hard, then looked up. "Please, before you kill me, I want to speak to my mother." Just once. The officers exchanged glances. One of them nodded. "Go and call his mother," he ordered a junior officer. The officer left immediately, making his way to Destiny's house. When the officer arrived at the house, he knocked firmly on the door. Janet opened it, her eyes red and swollen from endless crying. "Madam," the officer said gently, "your son Destiny is in our custody. He wants to speak with you before his execution." Janet's heart stopped for a moment. Her hands trembled as she covered her mouth. Jide, who was sitting quietly in the corner, stood up. "We are coming," he said simply, his voice heavy with pain. Janet wiped her tears and followed the officer. Jide walked beside her, his step slow and heavy. Neither of them spoke. What was there to say? The weight of what was about to happen was too much to bear. When they arrived at the prison yard, Janet saw her son tied to a wooden pole. His face was pale, his body thin and weak. But his eyes, those eyes that once held innocence, were now filled with something else, regret. Janet burst into fresh tears. "My son. My only son," she wailed. Destiny looked up and called weakly, "Mommy, come close. I want to tell you something." Janet rushed forward. Jide stood a few steps behind, his eyes filled with silent pain. Destiny gestured for his mother to lean in. "Come closer, Mommy," he whispered. "I have a secret to tell you." Janet sniffled and leaned in, bringing her ear close to his lips. Then, in a shocking move, Destiny bit down on her ear, hard. Janet screamed in pain and fell back, clutching her bleeding ear. Everyone gasped, the police officers, Jide, the other prisoners. The officers rushed to separate them. "What is wrong with you? Why did you do that?" one of them shouted. Destiny, breathing heavily, looked straight at his mother. His voice was filled with pain, anger, and deep sorrow. "My mother is the one who destroyed my life," he said coldly. "My father corrected me, disciplined me, warned me. But my mother, she defended me. She encouraged me. When I stole, she called me a smart boy. When I lied, she covered for me. She told me I was lucky instead of telling me I was wrong. Now, look at me." Tears streamed down Jide's face. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I warned you, Janet. I warned you, but you never listened. Janet collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. The officer in charge took a deep breath. It's time. A few moments later, gunshots echoed through the air. Destiny and his gang were no more. Jide fell to his knees, his hands on his head. Destiny, he cried bitterly. My son, my only son. Janet lay on the ground, unable to move, unable to speak. The reality of what she had done to her own child had finally hit her. This is a lesson for all parents. Dear parents, train your children well. Correct them when they are wrong. Discipline them with love. Do not cover their mistakes, thinking you are protecting them. A child who is not corrected today will bring sorrow tomorrow. What lesson did you learn from this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. Kindly like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more interesting stories. See you in my next episodes.